Actually called Reshaping Adolescents, Gender Attitudes. It's about gender equality in India and working with kids in schools. And it's with Divadar and Tarun Jain. So just let me start with some big picture motivation of, there's reason to study gender equality in all countries, but on a lot of dimensions, gender gaps are larger in poorer countries. So maybe warrants even more attention. Here's a figure that's plotting on the horizontal axis, a country's GDP per capita. And then on the vertical axis is a measure where a higher value is a gap favoring men. This is the college going ratio. This is one where in a lot of rich countries, more women go to college than men. But as you get to poorer countries, that gap is favoring men. And you would see the same sort of pattern where gender gaps look bigger on the left in poorer countries for primary school, secondary school, college, health, like life expectancy. Women live longer almost everywhere, but that's less true, presumably because of some behavioral factors in poorer countries. And so that's one way of one takeaway from this is that thinking about gender equality in poor countries is important. Another is that this might be partly causal, that the process of economic development and economic policies might be one of the most effective ways to narrow gender gaps if this correlation were causal. And I do think there are lots of reasons why economic development can be good for gender equality, especially around labor market outcomes and other benefits that flow from labor market success, like investment in education or decision-making power within families. With economic development, more of the economy is on occupations that require brains rather than brawn, and that's where women have a comparative advantage. It also means a lot of home production. We throw capital at the problem instead of labor, and if it's mostly women's labor that's doing that housework, then that frees up women's time to be more engaged in the formal labor market, or at least labor market outside of home production. And then finally, the demographic transition, that part of economic development, or what goes hand in hand, is smaller family sizes, and that allows women to invest longer in education, have careers, have continuity in the labor market. So those are all reasons why we might expect progress over time as countries develop. And we do see that in a lot of countries, that, the corresponding to that cross-sectional pattern, if we looked within countries, poor countries and middle-income countries, a lot of these metrics of gender gaps seem to be getting better.
Do you think there is some cultural factors involved, like Western countries tend to be more equal than Japan, for instance, which is a developed country?
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I'm going with this, which is, if you kind of think about this correlation, there's the best fit line is this line, but there's a lot of variation around that line. And there are also some aspects of gender equality that just don't fit that pattern at all of a link. And so whether that's, broadly thinking of poor countries or rich countries, or comparing within rich countries or within poor countries, I do think that a lot of the rest of that is explained by, social norms or cultural attitudes, or just something that's, at least today, doesn't feel that much about economics. Like maybe those were rooted in economic conditions a long time ago, but at this point they live on their own as cultural norms. And so that's where, this project, I think a lot of the exceptionalism of India, which is where this project takes place around gender equality, is not because it's poor. It's a lot worse than other similar countries. It's not something about the structure of its economy conditional on GDP. It's about some cultural norms. And so, I think that doesn't mean you have to take a different tack to solve the problem, but it does open up space to say, let me try to change those cultural attitudes directly, which is what this project is about. So I think, even if economics could solve all of it, we might want to speed things up with policy, not wait centuries for India to be as rich as the US is today, or whatever, decades at least. But I think kind of what my work on gender equality, I think some of the stubborn has made me realize there are some stubborn aspects of this, where some dimensions of well-being for women are not getting better as India has grown rapidly, or they're actually getting worse. And so I think two salient examples are the skewed sex ratio, where the number of boys born relative to girls is very high because people, when they're pregnant with a girl, they often will have an abortion. That's been getting worse, and it's partly because the technology is cheaper and people want smaller families, but nonetheless, it's not as if economic progress is eroding that desire to have a son. And second, women's employment, where in India it's been falling in the past 3 decades. So just to give you a sense of the magnitudes, the male to female ratio at birth overall in India is 1.1. And in a lot of the states in North India, including the state where this study takes place, it's 1.2. So 6 boys born for every 5 girls. And then the female labor force participation is 24%. So, Vietnam is a similar GDP per capita and has 70% female employment. And so I think, cultural attitudes underlie these gender disparities in India. And I think, that's not just naming the residual cultural attitudes. I think in both of these measures, there's very specific cultural attitudes that matter. So there is a religious view that sons bring status to the family in India. They play a role in, it's a patrilocal society. So parents go and live with their eldest son. They pass inheritance to him, and he plays roles in religious ceremonies for them. And then in terms of female labor force participation, I think it's a different cultural norm. It's about women's chastity or purity needing to be protected. And so I think, India happens to have both of these, in terms of sons bringing status to the family, that you see a skewed sex ratio. In other countries where there's a patrilocal society where kind of eldest sons play a big role, like China and the Caucasus, in terms of women's purity, there the similarity is really to a different set of countries, like in North Africa and the Middle East. And those are all places with very low, abnormally low female labor force participation. Okay, so what do you do, if there are these cultural attitudes, what do you do? I think part of what made this project possible is that government policymakers would like to solve these problems, partly because they care about human rights, but honestly, a lot of it is just practical. You don't want tens of millions of young men who would like to get married and can't, running around in your society. That seems like a recipe for unrest and disaster. And then in terms of female employment, India, like a lot of North Africa and the Middle East, has actually closed gender gaps through high school. So you have all these highly educated women who aren't working. It's sort of the quickest win to increase GDP per capita is to put that human capital to work. So how do you solve that problem? I would say to date, I'm just focusing on the sex ratio because that's actually the project ultimately is, I think, going to have more of an effect on female employment. But the original genesis was the government's interest in the sex ratio. So just to give you a sense, there are a lot of policies to address it. So it's illegal, and the government puts quite a bit of effort into enforcement of the law against sex-selective abortions. And then the other strategy they follow is saying, okay, yes, it might have a cultural root, but you can still use economic tools. So they provide financial incentives to families that if you have one daughter or you have 2 daughters, and then one of the couple gets sterilized, then you get some financial payments. Often it's in the name of the daughter, but you get payments in gold or cash or other items. So this is the first project I started after I had tenure, and I think this project reflects that in many ways. First of all, it's sort of a very long run project, but another one is that, government wanted to evaluate, they came to us, they wanted to evaluate and vary these financial incentives. So they came to us with a very economic intervention, and we counter proposed, can we try something different, which is to change these cultural attitudes? I guess just under the view that there isn't a lot of effort in that way along those lines in India, and it feels like it might be promising. It might have more long run potential than these financial incentives, which are quite expensive. And specifically, what we do in this project is work with adolescents in school. So it's adding to the school curriculum some discussion of gender equality with the goal of moving people in the direction of supporting more gender equality, so that when they're adults, the boys who are in the program will be more supportive if their wives want to work, or they'll invest equally in their sons and daughters, or they'll have more daughters to begin with. So the curriculum it's very much a discussion-based curriculum, where the idea is it's not sort of being lectured about facts about gender equality, though it's definitely not a neutral intervention, but it's trying to get kids to think about and discuss gender gaps, and both human rights arguments for why equality might be good, but also, economic or practical reasons, like you're leaving money on the table if you're not allowing women to work. So discussing those arguments for gender equality and kind of just thinking about gender equality, that will systematically change attitudes in a way that generates more support for equality, and that in turn will change behavior. So what we do in the study is our primary outcome is going to be kids' attitudes. They're like still adolescents living at home. We have some self-reported behavior, but our hope is that in the longer run, we can track the sample and measure behavior, like kind of harder real behavior, like age of marriage for the girls, or the employment of the boys' wives once they're married. So the program was done in government secondary schools for grades 7 to 10. So it was 2 cohorts, and it was a 2.5-year program. So one cohort was in the program in grade 7, 8, 9, and the other in 8, 9, 10. And what the program consisted of was a discussion in classrooms, like in class during the regular school day, about once every 3 weeks, 27 sessions overall over these 2.5 school years. There were some small homework assignments in addition, and there were some school-wide assemblies sometimes, but these classroom discussions were most of the dosage. And as I mentioned, we want to follow the sample for many years. The implication for what I'm going to show you today is we have a very big sample, but pretty soon we'll be able to see girls, I guess they're young women now, but their college completion, age of marriage, female employment, and then eventually they'll have families, and seeing what they do vis-a-vis their own children. So we kind of started by saying we wanted to change attitudes, and then we had to think, okay, what should we do? Should we have radio ads targeting adults, or what? You can think there are lots of options of how and with whom to focus for changing attitudes. We focused on adolescents in schools for a few reasons. One is adolescence is a time, or just youth is a time when people have more malleable views. You're not as stuck in your ways as when you get older. And at least for this format of program where it's debating, it's helpful to be a little bit more mature so that you can have these classroom debates. I'm trying to start something with thinking about this with 3 to 4-year-olds. They might have even more malleable views, but the approach will be different from like debate based. And then, schools are also just a really powerful way, like medium for governments to influence values in a society, for good or bad. Hopefully you agree that in this case it's for good, but there's close to universal enrollment in secondary school, and if, as is the case here, the government is ahead of a lot of its adult population in terms of this human rights issue of equality, then you can use schools to try to have some moral education. And schools already kind of do this, like whether it's teaching us to care about the environment or something like that, it's not unheard of to use schools for this purpose. So what we're going to do is evaluate a version where an NGO delivered the program, and it really was like intended as a proof of concept. Does this curriculum work? It wasn't intended to be the way you scale up the program, but we think this could be cost effective if it was taught by regular government teachers, or maybe you can embed some of the lessons in like textbooks or multimedia rather than having it delivered live by a teacher. Okay, so a little bit more on the program. It was designed and implemented by an NGO called Breakthrough. They focus on different aspects of what they call gender human rights, or kind of human rights issues related to women and girls in India. So like early marriage and domestic violence. And so this is a program that sort of covered lots of aspects of gender equality. And most of their work is sort of multimedia, kind of creating TV ads and billboards, but they had recently started working in communities. And so this was a natural direction for them to work, to kind of design this to work with kids. So as I mentioned, there are these 27. Yep.
Seema, may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Does the program have like sex education, classes on sex education?
No,
I understand that this would be hard, but could you tell us a little bit more about this, please?
Yeah, so let me just tell you what is in the program. So there is no sex education. That's just like the government. Even like domestic violence, even sex selective abortion. The government didn't want the program to be explicitly talking about sex selective abortion, just to like pregnancy and abortions were they didn't want that directly talked about. So there is some discussion in the sessions about the skewed sex ratio, but like how that arose is like verboten. And I think that just reflects like a very conservative society. So this was, so there is some discussion of about domestic violence. But I would say this is not say as like, maybe as, it's not as open of a conversation around sexual violence or reproductive health as you might see in other societies.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So Breakthrough, in this case, Breakthrough hired staff to run these sessions. So there are 150 treatment schools. They hired 15 facilitators. Each of them handled 10 schools. So they were going to each school once every 3 weeks. So they would kind of do a rotation and spend a day in a school and go to then the next school. And then the regular teacher, they could do whatever they wanted. Sometimes they participated, sometimes they listened in the back, and sometimes they just enjoyed an hour break. And I'll come back to this at the end. I think one thing about scaling it up with government teachers is not all of them will be supportive of gender equality, whereas these Breakthrough teachers could be hired. They were hired for this curriculum, so they believed in gender equality. So there were a bunch of different topics. Like the kids would just discuss their attitudes and, sort of see like people would say, why do you believe this? Why do you believe that? How many people support this? There were some on difference in aspirations. Sometimes it was eye-opening for boys to realize girls have similar career aspirations, and yet very few of them will probably work when they're adults. They talk about tolerance of discrimination. So sometimes not just your own behavior, but tolerance of what other people do. And there were also a few sessions on communication skills, under the view that first and foremost, the program's trying to change your attitudes. That might not be enough to change your behavior. You also have to convince other people. And so those communication skills, like convincing your parents to let you go to college, are important. And like this theme of attitudes are maybe necessary, but not sufficient to change your behavior, this will come back a couple times in the talk. This is a Breakthrough photo. So it's not, it's not a random sample of photos of the sessions, but it does highlight one thing that makes this different from the regular school day, which is it's much more interactive than the regular school day. And that's relevant because, we were worried, will boys like the sessions? Will they be bored? Will they disengage? I think one thing that made this enjoyable to students, like that kept students engaged, is that they're usually talked at in the regular high school curriculum style of teaching in India. So this was sort of more animated than usual, and so that was helpful.
Seema, a question regarding that part. Do you have an idea to what extent the instructors of the program, were they more qualified or less qualified than the usual teachers? To what extent this is a kind of a refresh of the education of these kids in a way that help to engage them on this topic?
So I think that these Breakthrough teachers differ in two main ways from the government teachers, or maybe three. Like one is, they're more dynamic. Like this is a discussion-based program. Breakthrough knew that when they were hiring them, so they hire people who are good at facilitating a discussion. Just like there are different styles of teaching. Like leading a business school case is a different style of teaching than like lecturing, and so these Breakthrough teachers were chosen for that. They're also younger, and so I think in that sense, like they might be seen as cooler. They're like urban, city. So like the kids probably looked up to them, and they believed in gender equality. So in that sense, like if you had to just transplant this and have government teachers teach it, which one state in India is now doing, I can preview. I think that is like a big unknown how much of this will translate with a very different person leading the discussion. I'll also mention that, there are 15 facilitators, 13 of them are men. And that was because it's almost part and parcel of this problem. Like you have to cover 10 schools, so like a pretty big geographic area. And given the conservative norms, like there were fewer women who applied to that job or like whose families allowed to have that job. So, especially kind of vis-a-vis the boys, having male instructors, I think it'd be easy to scale up with male instructors, but like they were also mostly male.
Right, because here it seems that the intervention, you are varying both the message and the messenger, right? And when I think about the scale up, maybe the messengers available will be a bit different.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, I also think there's like an interesting question of just, the causal effect of like non-rote learning, so like in some ways, if we looked at outcome, we have like a secondary outcome of self-esteem or something, or, like leadership, I don't know, like you can imagine this having an effect on kids liking school, not because of the content, but just because of the style. So, there's like a economics of education direction someone should go in on just non-rote learning and what it does to kids. But yeah, no, I definitely, I'll come at the end, I'll talk about like scale up. And I think I sort of think this issue of you need the right messenger is pretty important. Not because we have evidence on it, but just that's my prior. So I'll just talk about one session, both basically because it's the session for me where I could see how both something can be eye-opening for students, even if it's not, it feels kind of obvious. And then, second, how just kids can, maybe it's just one point I'm making it, which is that, kids can like have taken some things for granted, and then you could just lead them into discussion where some of them might change their view. So there's one session on household chores where they break into groups and discuss who does different chores in their household, like the cooking and the laundry. And then they come back together and they share their answers. And, lo and behold, it's the women and girls who do all of those chores in their household. And then they discuss, the facilitator asks, why is that? Is that fair? And then usually, someone will say, well, women are better at cooking than men. And then the facilitator will say, well, if that's the case, like who's doing those same tasks outside of the home? And, it's men. And then like, doesn't that mean that would create more joy in the world if women were cooking at weddings and restaurants, if they're so amazing at it? Like, why, if they're better at it, why aren't they doing it outside the home? And, do you get equal prestige or power in society by doing it outside the home and inside the home? So I think it's like possible someone has a backlash, or possible someone kind of thought through all this and still held on to their view. But I think in a lot of cases, kids just haven't really thought hard about these questions. They have some facile ideas, and having to kind of justify why they think it's fair might make some of them reconsider and say, maybe it's not so fair or not so, economically sensible to be constraining what women can do. Okay, so, kind of what is the intervention doing, if we think about economic concepts, it's a bundle of doing many things. So we're not going to be able to separate out mechanisms with this. We're just going to have one treatment group and one control group. But just to give you a sense of like what was the theory of change, it was mostly trying to change preferences. And I think this is probably where it's maybe most different from a lot of the both interventions that are going on in by governments and NGOs, but also where we have an evidence base is this isn't mostly trying to just make people change what they think is right and wrong. So a boy, when he's later and his wife is working or his sister wants to go to college, he thinks it's sad and he's upset if his parents don't let his sister go to college, and that's what it's trying to change. Is also it's changing beliefs and knowledge. Like what, if you haven't thought through that you're leaving money on the table by not allowing women to work, that's kind of more closer to knowledge than preferences, I would say. And then it was trying to teach some of these skills about communicating preferences to parents. Okay, so in terms of the related literature, the main one is this literature on preference formation, where there's a lot of work showing that different interventions influence gender preferences, like television or whether your mother worked. I think one thing that's true about most of those papers is that in most cases, it wasn't a policy that was intended to change gender attitudes. It was like cable television, or, maybe you could say the female politicians quotas for female politicians was trying to change attitudes. But I would say even that, it was sort of not a primary goal of that policy. So that links to a second literature, which is on persuasion, which is the idea of like adds in the intentionality. So it's communication intended to change beliefs or preferences or behavior. So I think in economics, a lot of the literature is on firms and politicians advertising, so political advertising and firms advertising. Outside of economics, like the closest are studies that evaluate anti-discrimination campaigns, so like anti-discrimination campaigns against the mentally ill or something like that. Another related literature, not as direct, are papers that try to change perceptions of social norms. So don't change your own attitudes, but just change what you think other people believe, because part of how we decide what to do is not just what we think in our heart of hearts, but also trying to conform to what other people think. The last paper listed here is this Cantoni et al. Paper, which showed that the communist government in China changed textbooks to have more of a communist message and more of an anti-market message. And they show that kids who were exposed to more years of those textbooks hold more anti-market views as adults. So this is both, evidence that governments can shape attitudes through the curriculum. It's also a reminder that there's a gray area at some point. At some point, whether persuasion is in a good direction or a bad direction ends up being a matter of taste at some point. But like I said, I think this intervention is pretty, it's not like, it's pretty safely in the territory of like equal opportunities. And finally, we relate to a large literature on gender inequality that I'm not going to try to summarize. Okay, so to tell you about the research design, the study takes place in.
There's another, maybe it's like more distance than yours, than your paper, but those training intervention, like short-term training interventions. This paper is by Horacio Atanasio in Colombia, and Dave Descartes and IEDB authors in the Dominican Republic, in which they find better results for women. So these are like very short length interventions, training interventions. So after the schooling period, my impression is that most of the effects come from soft skills like self-esteem and resilience.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's another.
There is like a related literature, even a more closer literature in developing countries on like girls empowerment programs. Like it'll be like a safe space for girls where they'll kind of say, trying to kind of raise aspirations of girls and their self-esteem. And there's a little bit of this in this intervention of like, you should feel good about yourself. But a lot of the effect, when we see effects, say, on girl self-esteem, but it's mostly indirect. It's not because they were sort of saying like, girls, you should feel good about yourself. It's more that, kind of hearing about these messages about equality was somehow like energizing to the girls, and it in turn changed it. So yeah, I guess like this was, this is a lot of those empowerment programs, like you wouldn't have the exact same programming for boys. It was all here, like boys and girls. Not all of the schools are co-ed, but like in the co-ed schools, it's like the exact same message, which is sort of it's not saying like you should have higher aspirations. It's that, girls, we shouldn't close opportunities for girls. Like that's kind of the messaging. So I think that there is this literature on, girls empowerment, and like, that's like more psychological training. So I guess this wasn't sort of like psychological training as in that sense, but it had some of the same effects. There's also a related literature about like girls in STEM. In India, girls in STEM is not the big issue. That girls have higher board exam scores in secondary school and math and science than boys do. That's not the as big of an issue as it is, say, in the US, but that's another literature on like girls and STEM.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the project takes place in the state of Haryana, which is in North India, and it takes place within these 4 districts that are near New Delhi. And within those, we took most of the government secondary schools, or we kind of threw out the very small ones and the very large ones, and we picked at most one per village to try to minimize spillover, since kids don't really interact that much outside of their village. And so that left us with 314 government secondary schools, and 215 of them are co-ed and 99 are single sex. So I'll tell you now, like we did heterogeneity by whether the school is all girls, all boys, or co-ed. We see similar effects. We can't, it's partly, there's whether you're co-ed or not is not random. So it could be correlated with other stuff, but I can tell stories why it would be more effective in a single sex school or more effective in a co-ed school. And it's possible that like all those things are happening and it nets out to 0 on average. Breakthrough had bandwidth to work in 150 schools. So we have 150 treatment schools and 64 control schools. So we started the baseline survey in fall 2013, and we enrolled 14,809 students. And so they were in grade 6 and 7, and then the school year starts in April in India. So like the program launched April of 2014, and they were in grade 7 and 8. And so what we did is we handed out paper consent forms in the schools, and then of the kids who returned them, we randomly chose 45 of them to enroll in the study. And so one thing we were worried about was like maybe parents wouldn't consent, but we find a really high consent rate. So it's 90%. And it seems that most of the time when we didn't have the consent, it was because the kid lost the form or forgot the form, like that's what they told us. And we can look at correlations, and it's not as if there's differential consent for girls versus boys or less consent in conservative villages. So it seems maybe parents should have. I think one of my surprises of this project is like parents didn't push back as much as I would have expected. And to be clear, like they could push back and not participate in our study, but the curriculum, even the kids who weren't among the 45, they were still in the intervention. Like this was just the government policy of the school curriculum in these schools. We also surveyed a subsample of parents at baseline to look at heterogeneity by the parents' attitudes. The reason we didn't do all of them is we survey the kids in schools. That's a lot cheaper because they're all in only 314 places rather than 15,000 places. And so it's much more expensive to go to the houses. Then we did an endline survey 3 years later. So the program was 2.5 years. So this is like on average about 3 months after the program had ended. And so at this point, the kids are here, they're 12 years old, here they're 15 years old. And then I'm going to show you results from a second endline, which was 2 years after the program had ended, or 2.5 years after the program had ended. And just to see if do these changes persist after kids are no longer participating. And so at this point, the kids are 17 years old on average. And we had pretty high retention in our sample across those. So the data collection was done by JPAL South Asia at baseline, and most of the first endline, the surveys were at schools in the courtyard by same-sex surveyors. By the second endline, kids have scattered to different schools, so those were all done at home. Here's some characteristics of the sample, and first of all, just to show you there's balance between the treatment group and the control group, and then just get the ages in your head. They're 12 at the beginning, and then 15 and 17. Actually, I'll mention this line here, which is, I hadn't really thought about this beforehand, but there are more girls than boys in government secondary schools in India. And that's because there's close to parity in overall secondary school enrollment. And then parents are more likely to send their sons to private schools. So we only worked in public government schools. And so there's actually more girls than boys. And then we sampled in proportion to that, 55-45. The sample is mostly Hindu. This is a Hindu state in India, predominantly Hindu state in India. And then you see 29% of kids' mothers are working, which is, kind of on the same order of magnitude as the India-wide pretty low female employment rate.
Seema, is child labor an issue, a problem there?
No, it's not. Partly because it's like these are districts adjacent to New Delhi. They're richer, so richer than some parts of India, and it's still rural, but like parts of rural India can be like very high density. So this is less agricultural than some parts of India as well, but not like manufacturing like in cities. So there isn't a lot of child labor. And there's very high secondary school enrollment. So like 80, high 80s secondary school enrollment. So I think, especially on gender equality, I think, and I've been talking to some folks in North Africa, I think there's a lot of similarities between India and North Africa in that, like, they made this huge there's very little of a gender gap through secondary school. That's partly maybe for a bad reason, which is like, it's parents like the incarceration effect until you get married, it keeps you busy or something. But I think there's also positive returns to education in the marriage market, at least up through secondary school. But then where you start to see the wedge is in college completion, and then a much bigger wedge once you get to employment.
Sorry, what about teenage pregnancy?
Almost negligible. Yeah, that's there's I don't know if there's any good data on like premarital sexual activity in India to compare. Maybe it's much lower than I think in a lot of other parts of the world. And in some ways that's part of the gender equality weirdness. Like one of the outcomes we'll look at in our behavior index is like whether you talk to kids of the opposite sex. Like it's like a very in probably an unhealthy way, like girls don't, even like 14-year-old girls don't talk to 14-year-old boys. Like what you would normally think of as this like age where there's a lot of flirting in schools, et cetera. There's like an amazing amount of sex segregation. So it's almost like, India has the opposite problem of societies that are worried about teen pregnancy. So this is the first project where I used a pre-analysis plan, and we tried to stick as closely, it's not like exhaustive, but we tried to pre-specify basically what our outcomes would be, just because it's not like a labor market intervention where it's obvious we want to see employment or earnings, and like so we wanted to constrain ourselves basically. So the specification is pretty straightforward. We're going to have some outcome, and it's going to be an index in most cases. And then the dummy for whether your school was in the intervention will control for the baseline outcome. And then we have a small set of fixed effects for gender grade and district grade. And then the error terms are going to be clustered at the school level. We have a second specification where we use double lasso to choose control variables. We have similar results. I'm not going to show you those in the presentation. So we specified 3 primary outcomes. One of them is attitudes, and that's the one I think of what kind of we are best able to answer, because we could sort of ask, like a pretty long battery of questions that are capturing, validated questions on attitudes from the World Values Survey and other surveys that are about, so attitudes about not kind of what you want to do with your own life, but what you think is right and wrong. Like, should girls get equal opportunities to go to school as boys? And then we have one outcome that's just for girls, which is their own aspirations, so like their own desires for education and career. And then we have a final one, which is gender behavior, kind of behavior that's related to gender norms. This one, I think was the most challenging one to create, because these are like 15 at the first end line, they're 15-year-old kids at home. They don't have a lot of say. So, they're not going to influence whether they're not going to have much influence on whether they go to a private school yet, probably. Like I expect the attitude change to translate into behavior more when they have more autonomy in their lives. But we asked questions where we thought they do have some ability to influence what they do. So like I said, kind of interactions with the other gender. We have some things on household chores, conversations with parents about your older sister's ambitions if you have an older sister. And then we also ask some questions just specific to girls about their own role in their decision making and their physical mobility. Like, can they walk to school alone? Which boys are always allowed to do and girls usually aren't. Okay, so we have baseline balance of those outcome variables, and they're normalized so that there's a standard deviation of 1 in the control group and a mean of 0. Okay, so this is the last slide before I show you the results, which is just to convince you, if you couldn't have already guessed, that there's like plenty of room for improvement in kids' gender attitudes. So here are 2 questions that are from the World Value Survey that are asked. It's asked on a Likert scale of like 5 points, and this is the percent that either say they agree or strongly agree. One on the left, it's a woman's most important role is to be a good homemaker. And on the right, it's that boys should get more educational resources than girls. And, this pattern is true. Like girls are more supportive of gender equality, or boys have sort of less support for gender equality than girls. But even for girls, I don't think in most societies you would see that 57% of girls think their most important role is a homemaker. And, and I should be clear that it's not that 52% thought girls should get it and 52% and 53 and 47 thought girls should get more education. If people didn't think boys should get it, they thought it should be equal. So, this is very much a kind of a patriarchal view, even among girls. Okay, so results, I can show you the main results for each of the end lines in one slide, because we have these 3 outcomes and it's an RCT and we have a big sample, so we don't really need control variables. And so here are the 3 outcomes. So we see this 0.18 standard deviation increase, and I didn't mention, but all of these questions everything's in a direction where a higher value means more support for gender equality, behavior in line with gender equality, higher aspirations for girls. And so we see this 0.18 standard deviation increase in support for gender equality. We don't see anything on girls' aspirations. And so that's partly because girls' aspirations, at least for the questions we asked, are already really high to begin with. Like, girls basically all want to go to college. They all want to have careers afterwards. Like I've just like spent time pondering whether it's good or bad that girls have such higher aspirations. Like, it's pretty clear in the control group, most of the girls are not going to they're not going to be able to achieve those aspirations of having a career after they work, at least unless something dramatically changes, we should expect 30%, maybe 35% of them to be working afterwards. But, well over 85% want to have a career. So partly it's that, they already had high aspirations in the way we measured them. It's possible there's a way to ask the intensity of them, like what would they have sacrificed to achieve those? And we didn't do that. So, and then for these behaviors, we see a similar 0.2 standard deviation kind of change in behavior in the direction of things you would hope would happen if in a gender equal society. To put the effect size in a little bit of perspective, focusing on the attitudes where the treatment effect was 0.18, one benchmark we have is, I mentioned we surveyed some of the parents at baseline. So we have we can use our baseline data and we have some same questions for the parent and the kid. We can throw in like a ton of fixed effects in every control variable and get the best correlation we can get between a parent having more support for gender equality and their kid having more support for gender equality. And we see that if a parent has 1 standard deviation more support for equality, their child has 0.11 standard deviations. So if that's causal, this treatment effect is larger than that. Maybe an easier one. Go ahead.
When you say parent attitude, in fact, is it based on data that was collected about the parents, or?
Yeah. So this is regressing the child's attitude. We have child's attitudes on their parents' attitudes with a bunch of fixed effects. So think of it as, like a pretty robust correlation between a parent's attitudes and a child's attitude. So, could be reverse causality if the 12-year-olds are influencing their parents. It could be an omitted variable, but that's one benchmark. I actually prefer this second one because it's not even trying to say anything causal. It's just what's the average difference in attitudes between girls and boys expressed in standard deviations, and it's 0.5. And so that means, this treatment effect, the intervention is not making boys as supportive of equality as girls were, absent the program, but it's not trivial in comparison to that. And then the final, and I think probably the best way, the most intuitive way for me to think about the effect size is not to do standard deviations, but just to take binaries of like supporting or not supporting gender equality and calculate what Matt Jenskow and Stefano Della Vigna call a persuasion rate, which is, and they propose this as like an apples and apples way of comparing different persuasion campaigns, which is like of the people who need to be persuaded, how many were persuaded. So in our case, it's like all the people and attitudes, student time attitudes, where, all of our 14,000 or 7,000 treatment group times 18 attitudes of the cases where there wasn't support for gender equality, like how many were converted by the intervention? And the answer is 16%. And so that's, to me, that seems pretty reasonable in the sense that I wouldn't expect any one intervention to solve a, complicated problem like believing boys and men should get more resources. And, even this style of intervention, it could be made more intensive and like you could embed some of this curriculum in more years of schooling. So it could even be like more dosage than this. Okay, so one kind of concern that we had, and I'm sure many of you have been thinking about, is maybe people in the treatment group, like they're just giving us the socially desirable answers. It's like an experimenter demand effect that the treatment group didn't really change their attitudes or didn't change their behavior. They just said they did, kind of lying to us because they wanted to look good to us. So, that kind of social desirability bias could be true overall. They're like, everybody wants to say they believe in equality, even if they don't. But the worry here is that the treatment group might be more likely to do that because they just had been in this intervention for 2 years that was telling them, outsiders believe in gender equality. So kind of, I think we have a few ways to address this. This is the primary one in the first end line, which is we added to the baseline survey a tool from social psychology that's measuring an individual's propensity to give socially desirable answers. It's called the Crown and Marlowe Index. And we use it for heterogeneity analysis. So what we do is, people are going to differ in how much they're likely to care about looking good to other people. And so if our treatment effects were driven by people who really cared about looking good, that would make us worrisome. If we see strong effects, even among the people who don't seem to care about looking good to others, that should make us a little bit more confident that these are real effects. So I've become a proselytizer for this Crown and Marlowe tool, at least for development economists who often are collecting their own data. And, we were often have like interventions that could influence, we were asking questions that are not always like objective measures, where there's some subjectivity. I say objective because I think people rarely like lie on objective things. Like I don't think they lie that much about, whether they completed college, but on these things that are just beliefs, I think, this is a worry in a lot of studies. And so the scale has nothing to do with gender equality. It's basically just asking you yes or no questions about whether you have some personality traits that are too good to be true. So they're like, I'm showing you 4 that we use a 13 question version, which is, like, I'm always willing to admit it when I make a mistake, or, there have been times when I was quite jealous of the good fortune of others. So, like me, I've been jealous of other people's good fortune on occasion. So these are like extreme questions. Like, I've never been jealous of anyone's good fortune. If people say that about themselves, like, it's possible that they're saintly, but the kind of validation within psychology on this measure is that that's often not picking up differences in saintliness. It's often picking up differences in the propensity to give socially desirable answers. So the idea is that you count up like how many perfect traits someone has, and that's probably a measure of disingenuous answers. So this is what we do with it. I'll focus on the first column to kind of illustrate it, which is, so first of all, this measure seems to work in the sense that the social psychologists were onto something. So this main effect of, I'm doing this as a binary just for ease of interpretation. So this is people who don't seem to care about looking good to others. They report less support for gender equality. So, it could be that they truly don't have as much support for gender equality, but the interpretation, other interpretation is that they're just not they're not inflating their answers as much to look good to the surveyors. What would have been worrisome is if this interaction term had been a big negative coefficient, that would have said, well, all of our effect is driven by the people with high propensity to give socially desirable answers, and we see nothing for the people who are more honest. We don't see that pattern at all. So we see the same effect when we focus on these students with a low tendency to give socially desirable answers. Okay, so treatment effect heterogeneity.
Seema, interesting enough, the results on desperation is significant, right?
Yeah.
It seems there is something about this aspiration, because as you said before, the aspiration were already pretty high, but at the same time,
So one interesting thing about the social desirability is, like, psychologists would say sometimes it's reflecting wanting to look good to others, and sometimes it's reflecting wanting to look good to yourself. Like, sometimes the person you're trying to fool is yourself. And so, I mean, it's possible on the aspirations people were trying to fool the surveyor, but like consciously or something, or subconsciously. But it's also possible this is one where, like, people like don't want to go to college, but they don't want to admit that. So when I saw that it shows up on aspirations, my interpretation was, is exactly that like people might be fooling themselves a little bit. I guess one thing to look at is, like, my theory would say you would see the same thing for boys, because it's not about what the intervention was about. It was just about, like, not wanting to admit it. But I don't know. My story doesn't necessarily expect a treatment different in the treatment group than the control group. But I agree that's it is interesting. So this is a cautionary tale that, if we had if the proportions had differed in the social desirability tendency in our sample, we might have seen an effect on girls' aspirations, and it might have been, kind of spurious. Okay, so we, I think the most, we pre-specified, we look at heterogeneity by gender and by parents' attitudes for that subsample. The interesting action is on gender, a student's gender. So we don't see anything on attitudes, or it's bigger. The effect is bigger for boys, but not statistically different from the effect for girls. We do see differences in behavior. And so we didn't, given that there seems to be similar attitude change for boys and girls, like, I think my ex post interpretation of this is that, once you change attitudes, you need to have the freedom in society to act on it. And boys have more of that freedom. So, like, we see things like whether they had conversations with their parents about supporting their sister's ambitions, and boys are more likely to do that than girls, or at least say they're more likely to do it than girls. And that's would be consistent with boys not facing as much backlash or punishment if they, tried to challenge their parents' views. And so it's like a sad irony that because boys and men have more power in society to act on what they believe in, in some ways it's like more important to change the attitudes of men than women. There are other reasons you would want to change women's attitudes too. So often it's not an either or, but it certainly is a reminder that you can't focus gender equality programs just on girls. And so coming back to that, like, you know, the most popular strategy of these girls empowerment programs, I think that can help. But, you know, that's a strategy that's sort of saying like, we're going to change what girls want and feel about themselves. And that's enough to kind of change their life outcomes. I guess if, you know, as long as we're in a pretty patriarchal world, you want to, you might have more effect if you change what men and boys think about what girls and what women should be allowed to do. Okay, so the other parental attitudes, we don't see any heterogeneous effects. I think this was another one where, you know, maybe this reinforces a progressive household. Maybe this could have had a bigger effect if you come from a conservative family. We see no average effect or average heterogeneity. And then we looked at a bunch of other things that people suggested to us. We don't see kind of heterogeneity by co-ed versus single sex, or we don't have a lot of power to look at male facilitator versus female facilitator, but, you know, we don't see much interesting in these exploratory heterogeneity. A couple secondary outcomes we looked at was school achievement. And we didn't look at school achievement in the way you probably are thinking, which was to see if girls studied more. Partly we just have aggregate board exam scores, so we don't have it. We only have self-reported disaggregated by gender, but we have the actual administrative data at the school level. You know, we didn't look at school. First of all, girls are already doing really well in school. So like they're doing better than boys in school. I think that's like kind of true everywhere at this age, but maybe even more so in India because girls don't have as much freedom to like goof off and go off and hang out with their friends. And so in some ways, like studying is one of the they have like a smaller choice set of what to be doing after school or on the weekends. But we looked at school achievement because, you know, this is crowding out 45 minutes every 3 weeks of something. And it was always a mix, like, because it wasn't a set time. So sometimes it was math, sometimes it was history. And so we wanted to just see whether it's like hurting anything else. And we don't see any drop in achievement. And, you know, it's not a huge amount of dosage. So, you know, it might be hard to detect. But honestly, I think this, like, it's possible to improve critical thinking skills enough to offset the loss of time spent on math or history. The other outcome we looked at was perceptions of social norms. So along the lines of work by Leo Burstein and co-authors, for example, which is, you know, did this change what you think other people think? And we do see that the treatment group perceives the norms in the community to be more gender progressive, which is a little bit, you know, interesting because it's not as if the intervention told them like your community supports this or something like that, you know, and it was not just about like your classmates, it was about your community writ large, but somehow the intervention, especially among boys, made them think, okay, like the norm in the world or the norm in my community is to have more equality for girls. So it's possible when we see behavior change, it's not being driven by the changes in their individual attitudes. It's also, or, you know, at least not exclusively, part of it is just like, okay, now I'm not going against the grain by supporting gender equality. Okay, the second headline, we see pretty strong persistence. These effect sizes, this was 0.18 in the first deadline. I think this was 0.2. So, and we continue to see nothing on aspirations. And so this is, you know, I was definitely surprised by this level of persistence. And I actually think this persistence is also another way of allaying some concerns about social desirability bias. It doesn't, you know, you could still give socially desirable answers 2 years later, but the treatment group, it's been 2 years since they've been in the program. At least my instinct is like people are not as primed to give those like right answers with 2 years intervening. We do see some different patterns for heterogeneity by gender, namely, now there's a bigger effect for boys than girls. Like the effect persisted more for boys than girls. And this is, here the attitudes are like scaled in a apples and apples way. So, you know, it's standard deviations, but we used the exact same questionnaire and the exact same weighting when we made our index. So so there's some fade out of there's still an effect, but it's smaller than it was at the second end line. Whereas for boys, there's persistence. And so, you know, it could be because maybe it's related to this boys being able to act successfully on what they believed in, and so that reinforced their attitude changes, whereas girls, kind of tried and failed and gave up. We didn't anticipate this, so we have no way of, kind of really knowing why we see this differential persistence. But obviously that'd be another reason why, if you had to pick, like having boys involved might make the biggest difference in the long run. And then we continue to see bigger effects on behavior for boys and girls, where here it's like both because they have more attitude change and because they can act on their attitude change more.
Do you have an idea about the absolute levels here, if they catch up, or there's still some gap between boys and girls?
There's still a gap, yeah. So like take on attitudes, the gap between boys and girls would be like 0.5 standard deviations. So this would close 1/5 of the gap between boys and girls. Yeah. So I mean, and that doesn't shock me, that this is.
Yeah, of course, but it's
truer to the
sizable.
So,
yep.
Yeah. In fact, I might have been worried if I might have been worried about social desirability bias if like boys were as supportive of gender equality as girls. Hopefully, in a couple of generations, people won't say what I just said. Okay, so what we also added on the second end line was 2 revealed preference measures. Where I would say that, from like kind of once we had these first results, we started to talk to governments. And I would say that, I think my lesson from this in terms of like the difference between soft outcomes and hard outcomes is the government couldn't care less about this kind of revealed preference outcome. Like they just want to see what happens to college, early marriage, early childbirth, female education, the sex ratio. But, I think this is more valuable from an academic audience of, if you're still worried about social desirability bias, one thing we could do is like have objective measures of people's behavior. And so we tried to pick things that were, logistically okay, feasible, and that got at some of the same concepts in our survey-based measures. So we had one, which is signing a petition opposing the dowry system. And we made a mistake of like making it too logistically hard to sign the petition. Originally, we had people sign, when we piloted, we had people sign as we were there to do the survey, and we saw like 85% sign the petition. And so that seemed like, okay, that's too easy. It's like, could be social desirability bias. And so we wanted to kind of, you had to believe in it intensely. First of all, we weren't there in your face making you feel guilty, but also we wanted something where, you had to put in some effort to sign it. So you cared enough about this. And the reason this was not just cheap talk is that we printed the names in the local newspaper of the signatories and we sent it to local politicians. So, other people were going to see that you were opposed to the dowry system. We have this low mean, so we don't have a ton of power, but we don't see anything here. We see this, 1 percentage point higher signing of the petition in the treatment group and the control group, but no effect there. We see the second thing we did was just for girls, which was we had a scholarship program. And so this is sort of maps closer to kind of aspirations or intentions to go to college, where, you might say, well, we didn't see anything on our aspirations index. Why did we focus on aspirations? I think kind of under this view that we realize one limitation of our aspirations questions is we're just like asking, do you want to go to college? But there's a big difference between, really wanting to go to college and making some sacrifices to do it versus like, I would do it if it was easy. And so here, this was not just revealed preference. I guess it was also sort of maybe on the like intensive margin of how intensely do you want to go to college. So we had a scholarship program where you had to fill out an application that we kind of made tedious intentionally. And then you had to kind of go mail it into us. And so the outcome is whether you submitted that scholarship application. And we see 41% in the control group submit and 44% in the treatment group. So, there's that difference is significant at like with a p-value of 0.08. So marginally significant effect. So I would call this, some suggestive evidence from the scholarship, and nothing from the petition. So, kind of take that as you into account. And, I would summarize our results as having strong evidence of changes in attitudes, more modest evidence of changes in behavior, and I guess the proof about behavior will be in our next end line when we have things like college enrollment and early marriage. So just a little bit more on this scholarship application. This table was intended to see, like, is this more about changing your desire to go to college or changing your likelihood of your expectation of going to college? Because in both cases, you should fill out the scholarship. One, you might have like already wanted to go to college, but now you've convinced your parents. The other is like, okay, you kind of want to go to college. Now you really want to go to college and you do it. And so it was kind of a horse race of, is it concentrated among people who already had high aspirations, or is it concentrated among people with low aspirations? And we see kind of a little bit of both of those channels I mentioned happening. So first of all, we see it's driven by people who had higher baseline aspirations. So this is using the continuous measure for ease of interpretation. This is just a binary, and you could see the effect is 4 times as large, 3 times as large among the people who have high aspirations. So this was about people who already wanted to go to college. Like, there's some variation in the intensity, and this kind of increased it. It's also higher among people who had already had engaged parents. So it wasn't about kind of like disengaged parents who didn't support your education, convincing them. It was sort of like taking people who are maybe already in the, 80th percentile of like likely to go to college and pushing them up even further. Okay, so just to summarize the results and talk about next steps, this intervention made gender attitudes more progressive by about 0.2 standard deviations. And at the first end line, it's similar for both boys and girls. I didn't mention this, but boys and girls start out at different places. They both move up by the same amount. It doesn't seem to be because of like some functional form thing. Like if we control for your initial attitudes, we still see pretty similar effects on attitudes in the short run. It changed self-reported gender equitable behavior, and more so for boys. That made more salient to me this point about the distinction between wanting to change kind of what your preferences matter for what you want to do, but other factors, your society also being super important for whether you can turn that into behavior. We don't see an effect on girls' aspirations. 2 years later, we see there's still attitude change observed for both boys and girls, but more persistence amongst the boys than the girls. And then on these revealed preference measures, girls seem to have this higher expectation or desire to go to college as proxied by submitting these scholarship applications. So my last 2 slides are on, where do we go from here? As I mentioned, we want to do longer run follow-up surveys to see these other outcomes. What's nice for us is that a lot of the outcomes, we don't need to ask the kids. Like, it'd be nice to see if the attitude change persisted. I doubt we'll do that. I think just because a lot of the kids will have scattered, but the parents are probably like still living in the same house, at least in the same village. And so most of the outcomes we care about, like parents would know about their kids or grandkids. So like, is your daughter married? What year did she get married? Tell me about your grandkids. From that you could learn age of childbearing, sex ratio, and things like that. Is your daughter working? Is your daughter-in-law working?
Seema, let me just ask a question about the persistence. It seems to me that the persistence will be associated with the opportunities that these girls will face while adults. So do you have any way of exploiting some variation in the different environments in which these kids are living and
yeah.
See,
Yeah, no, and I think it's a good point. And I think even just forgetting the treatment for a second, like I guess I'm interested in tracking the like trajectory of these. Take the control group girls and their aspirations. So where the difference is like the aspirations is what do you want to do in your own life, and I assume these girls' aspirations will fade, over time, like if they realize they're not realistic. And I just think like sort of a depressing topic, but like I think that would be interesting. And I agree with your point that like whether they fade and how much they fade should be a function of whether those aspirations are realistic to achieve. There unfortunately our sample, like there isn't a ton of variation in the environments. Like if we did this kind of across India, then in South India or North India. What we would like is if like there were maybe some factories or call centers open in some of these villages and not others, and so employment opportunities like started looking good in some villages and not, that we could exploit. I mean, I think it's a really good like idea. I think there isn't going to be a lot of there probably isn't enough variation for us to
right. Some anecdotal stories that we get, for instance, here in Brazil, is that there's a huge effort to stimulate students to pursue college, right? And with the claim that they could benefit a lot for high premium of that kind of education. But the thing is that the expansion of college supply happened with very low quality. So I know quite a few people that got their college degrees, and now they are pretty frustrated because that gains have never been realized. And so I think in the end of the day, I think they might be worse off than considering an alternative in which they could follow some a different route that will be more suitable for that environment. So and here there's a flavor of something like that, right? You might be there is something on behavior and constraints on gender issues which I think are easier to handle, but in terms of aspiration and an ambition to pursue a career, once the environment is not favorable.
I think here, like where we see stronger effects on attitudes, the idea might, the closest thing is like we could have made girls worse off by making them think it's unfair that they get fewer opportunities in life. Before they just thought that's like the way the world is, it's like given by God or whatever, and now they think their human rights are being violated, and that can make them worse off. So I think if we are able to track the sample in the future, I do think kind of trying to get at some like general level of life satisfaction or mental health or, happiness is useful. I mean, it's depressing to think of like you made people worse off by telling them they have human rights, but I think it's possible. I think this was less about, because it's like less about aspirations. It's not sort of saying like you should go to college, et cetera. But I do think like are you at peace with having being a second class citizen? And this intervention was trying to make girls less at peace with being second class citizens, and then whether that makes them happier, happier or less happy is an empirical question. But I do think it's an important point. I don't know what you do if you find the result that like you make people unhappy by telling them their human rights, but nonetheless, it's like worth knowing.
Exactly. Yeah. And maybe we need to combine this with other initiatives, right? Of changing the environment.
And this comes back to like, if you just focused on girls, I think it's much more likely that the aggregate effect is negative. Or I don't mean I expect it to be negative, but like I guess I worry less that the aggregate effect of the program is negative if you're also involving boys and men.
Right. Yeah.
So just to wrap up, so then there's kind of J-PAL, South Asia, and Breakthrough have been talking to state governments. The model I would think would make sense is to not have an NGO do it, not have regular government teachers do it, but to hire special purpose government teachers. So where like they would be government employees, they might not be as young and hip as Breakthroughs, but you could hire them. They should care about gender equality, and they are pretty good at leading a class discussion. And so, I think it'd be easy to find women because if they were in their own village, there are lots of unemployed women, and teaching is like an acceptable job. But, you could also try to have men and have them kind of do the Breakthrough model of doing that. So that's the model I'm trying to convince a government to try out. In the meantime, we've had success with the neighboring state of Punjab, like scaling this up to all 6th to 8th graders starting this year. So on International Women's Day earlier this year, the chief minister announced that it was going to become part of the curriculum taught by social studies and what are called like moral science teachers. So, I think it's an open question how well this will work for the reasons we talked about earlier of like, do they believe in this? Are they good at leading discussions? So right now, Breakthrough has trained the government teachers, and then it's going to roll out later this year. And so, we're not doing like an RCT or anything like that, but we're doing some helping the government monitor and like, kind of trying to assess impacts just to see whether, how well it translates when it's taught by regular government school teachers. But, I guess I'm optimistic that it probably doesn't do harm, even if it isn't, as effective as when Breakthrough taught it. So, however many 500,000, 600,000 kids a year will start having this curriculum in a couple months. So let me stop there.
Hi, Seema, just a question. I was actually surprised by what you told us about the results for the single-sex schools were about the same. I understand that that there's. You also mentioned that there's also already a lot of gender segregation inside schools, but I would say that like a program like this in a school with only girls will have a much larger impact, because like I would imagine that in the regular schools, girls would probably not participating as much, and in a discussion like this with only girls, they would participate much more. So I was wondering if you took a deeper look into that.
Yeah. So I think my own guess in advance was that when you had, for boys, I would have thought there was a bigger, for boys, I think it's more ambiguous which way it could go. Like on the one hand, they might be more open with their views if it's only men, but I think anecdotally, like part of it was just hearing girls' perspective on these issues was eye-opening for them. So in that sense, like, I think I would have guessed on net, it was better to be in a co-ed school for boys. For girls, and this is the interesting thing, both on this intervention and just in general, like any discussion in schools, girls participate as much as boys. They participate more than boys. Like you want to think about like the top of the class in Indian schools, like the good students who are the eager beavers are girls, not boys. So it's not the model of like shy girls or insecure girls. It almost makes it more of a travesty that like they fall off a cliff or there's a wall after high school or college for them. But they participate in the program. It's possible that, your point still could be true that they might, like the conversation might be more to their liking in single sex school. So, so I'm trying to think, what would girls get out of hearing boys' views? Maybe it's just empowering to see some boys change their minds, like to have their male classmates saying, oh, I never realized that before or something like that. Yeah. I think it's a good question of like, what exactly is that? Yeah.
Yeah. This is comparable with high girls' aspirations as well, right? What you just said, that they participate a lot.
We tried as a revealed preference doing something where like kids had to vote for a classmate to represent the class in some quiz competition where the whole class would get prizes if like in this inter-school competition. And then like when we piloted it, even in the control group, like the winner, everybody votes for the girls for this, because like, so I guess the gender equality in India does not extend to academic performance or perceptions of academic performance. It's like I don't know. I think everywhere girls are more diligent than boys at this age, but I guess, there don't seem to be these stereotypes of boys being like smarter than girls, presumably because girls are like at the top of the class. And so they want them to go represent them in the quiz contest.
Seema, I'd like to, I understand that you have conversations with some public officials, government officials about your research. And what I would like to hear from you is your impression on what the research really accomplished in terms of convincing these government officials to introduce the treatment. Because from my point of view, the cost of the treatment, of the intervention is so low. It's more like using masks in the pandemic. It's it's so low, the cost of using masks, that I think it's shocking that some people don't want to use. Same way, the cost of having, I don't know, 5 classes, 6 classes on gender equality is so low. Why would someone oppose to it? I understand that you tried very hard to make the outcomes of the treatment objective, but you know, it's hard, no? So I wonder, how much did it work in your conversation with the government official?
Yeah, and I think there are 2 aspects of what you're asking. One is, I think the first part is like, why do they need the evidence? Like, if it's low cost, why do you need to know their benefits? And I think the second part is like, you know, were there really benefits? Is like, is these measures objective? So I don't have anything more to say on the second part, but on the first part, let me say that, I think in some ways you could say, yeah, like why weren't people's priors that this was worth doing? I think the answer is that they're, you know, like school officials are getting lots of people coming to them wanting to add something on the curriculum, like we should have an environmental curriculum, or we should have more health education, or what have you. And so there is a constraint in terms of what you do. And then any change has some political costs, like, you know, some teachers don't want to do it. They have to learn some new curriculum, et cetera. And so I guess I think politicians and bureaucrats, there's like a ton of inertia, you know, there has to be something to compel them to change. And, you know, and if these effects seem big to them, they might have moved their priors that, like this was bigger than I was expecting. And, you know, it also gives fodder for them if there's some, you know, underling or peer who's opposed, to be able to say, this wasn't just like my opinion, you know, there's some evidence backing it. So, I think, I guess, like, I think there's many examples where people's priors are wrong and they go and pursue it. And so I generally think it's like good that people are not going with their priors, because some things that we think are beneficial have like unintended, you know, like some programs can have a backlash effect where, you know, you have the opposite effect. And so, you know, what do you do with like, I guess I think it's useful to have evidence to challenge our priors. And then I think the reason why, you know, even a prior is not enough for people, and like you needed to have a posterior belief that the effect was bigger, is just because any change, at least in the Indian bureaucracy, seems to be like have this wall of resistance. And so you need a compelling reason to make people do extra work.
Okay, thanks a lot, Seema. Congratulations, very interesting work.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks so much for accepting the invitation and for doing the girl mentoring.
Yeah, sure, my pleasure.
Goodbye, take care.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.